Welcome back to the beautiful shores of Milwaukee. This is Mythinformed, a Mythicist Milwaukee podcast.
Hey everyone, we'd like to take a quick moment to thank our fantastic patrons for their generous contributions. We would not be able to do what we do without you, so thank you so much.
Seriously, we do appreciate your financial support, and we want to hear your opinions and feedback. So please let us know what you think and join us on our monthly Patron Hangout. Welcome to Mythinformed with your host, Brian Edward, and today we have Kristyn Whitaker Hood on the line. Hey, Kristyn.
Hi, how are you guys doing?
Good. Today we've got with us the man, the myth, the legend, Richard Carrier, who is a scholar, a Ph.D., and a prolific author. I mean, if someone has read every one of Carrier's pages, you are definitely a smart guy. The guy that actually writes them, Richard, you're a brilliant man. You were also the first headliner at the first MythCon, and we met you, and you've been a friend of Mythicist Milwaukee since. So welcome, Richard.
Yeah, great to be here.
He's got an awesome blog. You can find him on Facebook. And his blog, he's been doing a lot of good stuff lately, including a debate with no one other than the Banana Man, Ray Comfort.
That's right, yeah.
I loved me some of that. How did that come about? I hadn't heard his name since the Reason Rally.
Yeah, apparently he's quite old. He complained about his age comes up in the debate.
Yes, it does, 68. Yeah, I remember. That was funny. He was like, Richard, I'm not getting any younger.
No, my age didn't come up in the debate. It wasn't relevant. But no, someone asked me, and to do things like that, like I charge, so they have to pay me, but my rates are pretty affordable. Right. And so they said, yeah, we'll pay you your rate. They negotiated, and so okay, yeah, I'll do it. And so, and in fact, I would have done 2 hours. I realized in that format, 2 hours would have worked better than one.
Yeah,
but because 1 hour, if you're doing an oral debate, that can be really exhausting and is stressful and stuff. But if you're doing it in that format, you have time to think, you have time to check the sentence structure, and you could check facts if need be and stuff. So it was actually a really neat format. I hadn't done a debate like that, where it's kind of like live Facebook chatting essentially for people to watch. Yeah, I'd totally do a debate like that again. I thought that was pretty neat. Needless to say, there was no contest.
No, I thought so.
He didn't even really engage hardly with my points, and was trying to get back onto his framing of his usual rigmarole, but he couldn't because I didn't set it up for him to even get onto his usual points. So that was tough for him.
That's what I really liked. My favorite part was the point when statutory rape came up, and they were talking about God's law versus positive law, and he brings up well what about a 15-year-old versus a shapely 18-year-old, and I was like, okay, but let's let it go. Let's let that go.
Into the child porn.
I know.
And he's citing federal statutes and stuff, and it was almost like he really wanted child porn to be legal, and he was like, but you can't argue that it should be illegal. And I'm like, I answered all that, but it was kind of weird. It was a really weird example. He wanted to trap me into defending child porn.
I thought the words barely legal were going to come up, when he said the 18-year-old. But then you get back at him, and you eventually come back. You're like, but the Talmud said it was 12. Yeah, and that's what I thought was the crushing blow, because
he started with this. It all comes from the Bible, and then he goes into this age of consent stuff, and I'm like, well, hold on now. This age of consent. You know what Christians were setting the age of consent? It was not 18. So I don't know what you're going on about. There's nowhere in the Bible where God says can't have sex with them until they're 18. No, it's not in there. Age of consent's not in there. But when you see the rabbis debating age of consent, actually, I could have gone further. I didn't want to digress on it, but really in the Talmud, the debate were between two camps of rabbis, and one camp was arguing for 7 and the other was arguing for 12.
Wow.
And the camp arguing for 12 sort of wins the argument by doing a horrible fucking concentration camp kind of science experiment where they get all these slave girls, a bunch of slave girls of different ages, and these rabbis are all inspecting their genitalia to look for at what age, try to catalog statistically at what age hair appears on the genitalia. So if you just picture this is horrific.
Wow.
But anyway,
did that really happen, or is that part of the legend sometimes as well?
Who knows? But
Okay.
it's the story, right? But it's in the Talmud. Like they portray it as officially this is how they confirmed, and they essentially came up with a if there's grass on the field, play ball rule.
I know.
I mean, I'm not joking. Like literally,
Yeah.
they say a single hair certifies a woman to be sexually available.
That was an off-color joke in 1985, and
right. And the funny thing is that's just biology. It's like obviously they have no concept of like consent or capability to consent, like cognitive development, or like where her mind is completely irrelevant, and that's like shocking and disturbing. So there's a lot of awful stuff in the Talmud.
Wow. Yeah, no doubt. And so that is definitely, that's worth checking out. There's a transcript of it available. You can find that on richardcarrier.info and take a look at that. It's definitely, it's worth a watch. And the other thing I want to mention for MythCon 4, you did come out in support of us. We really appreciate that. So, you're definitely from atheism plus all the way back to MythCon, and now you're a shitlord, and now you're somewhere back in between. We don't think that you're regressive left or a shitlord.
Right.
You are nothing but Richard
never
Carrier.
either of those things.
Right.
Those are just all exaggerated myths.
They are.
Yes.
And right. But you do like the debate, and that's the thing. That's what we want at Mythos Milwaukee is like, if you want to engage respectfully, bring whatever opinion you want, but let's be honest. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to talk about some honesty in religion today with Saturnalia. And I want to kick it over to Kristyn, who knows about more of this than I do. Take it away, Kristyn.
Okay. Well, it's a good day to have a holiday show. It's St. Lucy's Day. If you're the Scandinavian countries are celebrating that, and Hanukkah's starting, and Star Wars is coming out. So that's what I'm most excited about, I think, right now. Becoming a little bit of a Raylo fan. So I've got my tickets for that. But also, actually, it's a good time to talk about Dr. Carrier's post from his blog. It's blowing up on the social media pages that I work on. Virgin birth, it's pagan, guys, get over it.
Oh, yeah.
That's awesome.
That's yeah, it's a good time to share that one. We actually posted it, and I posted on a couple of my other pages, and it's just, Sean and I were talking about the other day, it's really blowing up on the pages. So I hope you're getting a lot of hits on that.
Yeah, I'm trying to develop the companion piece, which is the dying and rising gods being pagan, because that's much in need as well. And next, eventually, not this year, but eventually I'm going to do the baptism. Baptism is pagan. But yeah, well, that article needed to be written. Brian mentioned like the content of my blog. There's a lot of really good articles coming out every month, and this is because I've gone to the patron support model where patrons support me for every blog post. So I take very seriously I have to do it like at least 4 really good, useful articles that people can point to, cite, learn from, and so on. So that, having financial backing for my blogging. So if anybody wants to support me, go to Patreon and look me up, because that really does drive me to like excel and produce these valuable and useful content articles.
Yeah.
Definitely. I was actually just rereading that article. That article alone is just full of really valuable information. Probably not a lot of information Christians don't want to hear, but it's good. It's really good and very informative. And that's what I like about your work, is it really puts Christianity in context. And those of us who grew up in evangelical Christianity just don't have that wider view of what's going on in the context of Christianity came up in. You're really drilled into it's special and it's miraculous, and it's really nice to get the context of the greater world and the other religions that were informing Christianity at the time.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's kind of my role. One of my 2 main tracks in my life is to apply a Ph.D. in ancient history to informing atheists on these things, because usually people with these degrees or this kind of knowledge either don't care about the atheism versus counter apologetics issue, or they're Christians. So they don't talk about this stuff, or they lie about it if they do talk about it.
Right. And you put it in a way that I don't think insults the average Christian, because like what you're drilling.
Sometimes I do.
Right. when you're being the polemicist, okay. But there's times where I think that
you're right. Yeah, I do just present facts as facts. This is just what the truth is.
Yeah. Well, there's some ancient wisdom that I don't think the metaphors mean something completely different than what they actually mean. So what you're saying though is that there is some ancient wisdom in there. It's just not what you think it is.
Yeah.
You know, the green monster being envy. Well, it's not literally a green monster. But it's still a valid concept. So that's the point. So to me, if those that take religion as a philosophy, I don't think there's anything to be offended by.
Exactly. And there's those of us who have, I was raised in the Assemblies of God, so you spend a lot of time memorizing the Bible.
Yeah.
But only a very narrow context. You're really only taught to interpret it in a certain way. And when you're reading Dr. Carrier's work, you really learn a lot more about the context that it was created in, but you can understand it symbolically, and you get a lot more out of the Bible. Whether you be a Christian or an atheist or agnostic, you're able to really get a lot more out of the Bible and understand what they were, the people, when you understand the context of the time and the age.
It's something Robert Price always points out, is that these Christians who want to read the Bible literally and reject the discoveries of the actual symbolical and allegorical meaning are really doing the Bible a disservice, and are kind of like pissing in the face of the authors originally, because these authors wanted these messages to be clear. Mm-hmm. Well, they wanted to be clear for educated insiders, right? Like they wanted outsiders to be duped so they can laugh at them for being ignorant outsiders. But to be the smart insider is the person who actually understands what's going on. And some of these stories, their little symbolism and stuff is pretty brilliantly crafted. And you can understand the context, even if you disagree with the moral of the story, at least the way they're structuring this story is rather fascinating. And if you really want to understand the Bible, you really have to look at it that way. You can't go looking at it literally. I'm teaching right now I teach an online course every month. And for people who are interested in that, you can find that my course announcements at the Secular Academy. You can just Google that.
Right.
But I'm teaching New Testament studies for beginners, for lay people. And we were talking about parables and stuff. Like, how do you interpret this parable? These different Christian authors interpret this parable one way and so forth, like the parable of the talents and stuff. And one of the things I point out to them, and this comes from scholarship like John Dominic Crossan and all these experts on the parables, and I point out, like, the one thing you know for sure about the parables is that if you're taking it literally, you're wrong. Because Jesus says that himself in Mark 4. Mark 4 has Jesus tell the first parable, and then immediately Jesus takes his disciples aside and says, okay, if you're taking this literally, you're an idiot. That's basically what he says.
He who has ears, let him hear. Yeah.
Right. The real meaning I'll explain to you. The real meaning is the thing that's important. So first of all, you know whatever the meaning is, it's not literally what's being said. And then secondly, it's something shocking or controversial or counterintuitive. So the parables always have those two features. And so if any theory you have of what a parable means or what the point of it is, and it isn't both of those things, you're wrong. But once you get that tool, you start to see like how clever they were in trying to like create these countercultural messages that had these sort of moral messages that they wanted to use to reform society ultimately. But it required creating this new extended family, this new fictive family. So you had to join the movement, be baptized, you get adopted by God, you become part of the brotherhood or sisterhood. This becomes your new family, and then you had to follow the new rules and understand this new wisdom. And their view was that this would fix society. It was utopian and naive, but it's what they thought they were doing and thought they could accomplish. Of course, within 100 years, everything had reversed, and all their original communistic and egalitarian ideas were thrown out the window, and it was back to social hierarchy and gender hierarchy, and everything was back to normal. The rich can be rich and the poor have to be poor. It's all the same. So, within 100 years, Christianity just became yet another religion like every other freaking religion that was around at the time. All of its sort of revolutionary ideas at the start were gone.
Just under a new mythology, kind of rehashed mythology. But,
and is
go ahead.
Would that fit in then? When they were in that revolutionary stage, would they have been like very, very unique compared to like all the other religions? I mean, I'd asked you before, why did Christianity make it?
Not unique, but fringe.
Okay.
Right? So there were other cults like this that were these fringe little offshoot cults that the Essenes are a classic example. And the Essenes were respected, and even pagans were kind of in awe of them. but not a lot of people became Essenes. Like, there just weren't a lot of them. It was not the mainstream. It was never popular, but it existed as a thing. And then you had the Cynics among the pagan philosophy schools. Cynics were everywhere, but they were the minority school, and they had respect from some quarters and disdain from other quarters. They never became the popular philosophy. They became sort of the silly weirdo philosophy, the hippie philosophy.
So
there were more respectable philosophies that people could join. But the Cynics kept going for a good while, at least. And they're the same kind of concept, this countercultural hippie view of the world. Their idea of how to fix all the problems in the world is a little utopian and a little naive.
Are they the first anarcho-communists then?
I don't know. That's highly... Yeah.
I'm just joking.
It depends on how you're going to define all of these things. But they were definitely Marxists in the sense that if you look in the book of Acts, I think it's Acts 4, might be Acts 9, either 4 or 9, but there's this chapter, I think it's Acts 4, where they have this thing where it says basically the church was organized such that from each, everybody gave their money to the church and the church distributed it and said from each according to their means and to each according to their need. That's the Marxist credo. That's Marxism by definition. And in fact, it even goes Stalin-esque when people don't follow this rule and try to hoard back some wealth, and then immediately in a closed room surrounded by people who are arguing with them, suddenly they died, quote unquote, suddenly they died. It was God, right? And then, their bodies get tossed out and they go, well, God killed these people for not following the Marxist credo. And it's like, so,
No. Yeah.
I don't know if that story is true, but it's meant to scare people. It's like a Krampus story or what is it? The Yule cat I learned about the other day.
Oh, I haven't heard about that one.
That's an Icelandic story where the Yule cat will eat you if you don't do certain things on Christmas, like wash or wear your Christmas clothes or something. And parents tell their children this. So the Yule
unpaid babysitter.
My kids are too old for that to work now, so too little, too late.
Yeah. But the concepts were definitely communistic in that sense. The idea of sharing wealth, having no distinctions of wealth was kind of one of their goals. They saw that as one of the problems with the world, is distinctions of wealth.
Now you go to the Vatican.
Yeah, it's absurd. It's so absurd.
That's a funny thing. You're right. They start out with a certain ideology, and then they just seem to be more the same eventually.
Yes. Yeah. Religions they start revolutionary and become institutionalized. If they survive 100 years, they start to mainstream. And you see that with Mormonism too. Mormonism started really radical, and then like, well, no, actually, we don't like this polygamy thing. We're actually going to condemn it now. And all those Mormons who are still doing polygamy are weirdo fringe people, even though that was the foundational concept.
Yeah.
One of the foundational concepts of Mormonism. There are a lot of ways mainstream. It just became more and more ordinary.
Right. Now, that was part of this, like, looking at what happened to, like, the Jewish state in 70 AD. Did the Christians see this? And, is that part of the reason they change this up and make it less radical? Because, that Israel is essentially wiped to the ground, at least Jerusalem is.
Yes. It's hard to say because we don't really have documentation from the 70s to the early 2nd century of what was going on in Christianity. There's like a whole lifetime, a whole average human lifetime in which we have no idea. We have no letters. We have nothing telling us this is what Christians were doing and why. This is how things are changing. These were the conflicts. We just don't know. Like, the Gospels are being written in this time, but the Gospels are fiction set in a previous period, and so it's very cryptic as to what they're talking about. But one of the things they are, of course, responding to is the destruction of the Jewish temple. They're trying to capitalize on that and explain it. This was a problem for Christianity because it was a Jewish religion. They're saying we follow the Jewish God, who gave us this new revelation. But then people go, well, your God just let a heathen army walk in and destroy his own temple. So what good is your God? And so they had to come up with an answer to that. And so they came up with, God actually switched from the temple to Jesus. He abandoned the temple because it was corrupt. And here's a gospel story that explains all that. And we got that covered. And the rabbis for Judaism came up with their own sort of rationalizations for why that didn't falsify Judaism and so on.
Right. We're not praying hard enough. We're not deserving of the Messiah.
Yeah, it's that. Well, that's actually the thinking that created Christianity. Is the reason God won't bring the apocalypse, and the reason the prophecies that predict a specific year keep failing, is because Israel's a bunch of sinners. Y'all are a bunch of sinners, and until you stop sinning, I'm just going to hold back my promise. But there's a prophecy in Daniel 9, this story in there where they're trying to reinterpret the prophecy of Jeremiah. Prophecy of Jeremiah predicted the end of the world in a certain year. It failed. And so Daniel's like, begging and praying to God, like, why? How do I interpret this prophecy? How can it be true? And then this angel comes and tells him, and it's, no, you misinterpreted the years, you do the math differently. But when you look at Jeremiah, it's all about, and also the angels explaining, like, you were sinners. You're too big of a sinner. Your cities and your people were there's too much sin going on. God's going to hold back his promise until you stop sinning. But there will be this great atonement for sin that'll like sort of cancel sins, like this magic spell that like eliminates sin. And that will like eliminate God's reason for holding back his promise. And therefore that will bring in the apocalypse. And Christianity spawned from this. From people who want to know that whole story, I have actually, when Harold Camping a few years ago predicted the end of the world, and Wichita, an atheist group in Wichita, had a conference on that day and had me come give the keynote speech on Rapture Day.
That's right.
And I gave the talk, You're All Gonna Die, how the Jews kept failing to predict the apocalypse and created Christianity instead. Christianity makes sense as this. It's just like the Seventh-day Adventists, or just like the Jehovah's Witnesses, where the Jews are expecting the apocalypse to happen, and they're trying to explain why it didn't, and they're trying to reinterpret the calendar and all this stuff. But it does come down to how you have to clear sins of the people for God to like finally release his promise and finally bring about the end, like he predicted he would, and right all wrongs and all of that stuff. And Jesus' atonement, his atoning death, is supposed to be part of that picture. Like he atones for all sins. Now God can bring upon the apocalypse. The way is clear. And then they started with that whole idea of the apocalypse will come anytime now because, Jesus proved it with his resurrection and, atoning sin. And then, then you get the hundreds of years of failure at that and trying to reinterpret it and so on. There you have some with the wandering Jew theory, right? There is a Jew who was alive at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus, who's still alive today. And until he dies, the apocalypse will not come. Right. And this interesting thing has been played with in a lot of TV shows and movies too, I think. But there's a TV show called Forever that I think had a wandering Jew in it. Although he was a wandering Roman soldier, so it wasn't really the wandering Jew story. Mm-hmm. But he was like apparently a centurion who'd been alive since the crucifixion. And then the seventh seal or the seventh sign. Yeah. It's the one.
It might be the seventh.
It's not the black and white one.
The one with Demi Moore.
Correct. It's either the seventh sign or the seventh seal. One of those two.
I think it's the seventh sign.
I think it's the seventh sign. Yeah. But that's the same thing too with the Wandering Jew. And Jürgen Prochnow played the Wandering Jew in that story. Mm-hmm. Although I think once again he was a Roman soldier for some reason. But anyway.
Yeah.
Who'd been alive since and he'd gone insane because he'd been alive for 2,000 years and was trying to bring upon the apocalypse to end the world finally. So this myth has been played with over time.
Yeah. And it seems like in Daniel, that's one of the big ones, because I was always told there's like 500 or 600 prophecies that are predicting Jesus. And, some of these are always like, so, they're so, and some of these I'm like, how can that possibly indicate? But this one makes a lot of sense, right? This is.
It's causal. It's clearly causal.
Yeah.
Like, so the Christians come from a fringe sect of Jews who are really focused on Daniel 9 as the key to solving the apocalypse. And it really kind of inspires their entire religion. Like whether Jesus existed or not, it's not even relevant. Like if he existed, the Christians who are following him, whether before he died or after he died, really read what happened to him in light of Daniel 9. Like they're trying to it's very clear. Like you see this in Paul, where that's how they're interpreting it, and that's how they're reading it, and that's how they're using it. And they're doing the same thing with Isaiah 53, various other passages. And then, of course, they're building the story of Jesus in the Gospels out of these verses. So they'll take the Psalms, Psalm 22, they'll take Isaiah 53, and there's like little narrative details in it. And they'll say, well, then that happened to Jesus, even though there's no witness stories that tell us that really happened to Jesus. They'll just say it happened to Jesus and then claim a prophecy has been fulfilled.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, but this one at least makes sense. There were some that I couldn't even pick up. But obviously in order to get to the Savior has to be born, right, on Christmas. So that Jesus so is Saturnalia is that Christmas, at 90 degrees?
Well, no, yeah.
Go ahead,
it
Kristyn.
Way predates that. No, okay. Saturnalia predates Christmas, but it's very ancient. I don't even know how far
Pre-written record. Yeah, it goes back at least. I mean, written records references to it go back to the 200s BC, but we know it's much older than that.
And that's, I mean, basically Christmas is plastered over the ancient winter solstice holidays, you know, or pagan, and you know, it was good. Nobody was going to stop celebrating their winter solstice holidays. I think the first Christmas was on record around 336 AD. From what I've read, you could maybe tell better than that.
Actually, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if we have good records on that, but yeah, go on.
I couldn't verify that was the best source I read it at. And I think the Saturnalia I read was sort of dwindling out around 448. It was more of a carnival. It was, you know, losing steam at that point because Christmas was starting to, you know, Christianity and Christmas were starting to pick up there. But Saturnalia is the ancient, very, very ancient holiday that the Romans celebrated, which was different, I believe, from the birthday of the unconquerable sun, which was December 25th, I believe. So I think that would be something that would be worth talking about because there are two different holidays. I believe one was more about the sun, and that might have been more related to Mithras and the Sol Invictus cult. And then Saturnalia was really ancient. Oh
yeah. It's hard to tease them out. I mean, the Mithras and Sol Invictus one. We don't have good sources on Mithraism and its calendar. So it's hard to really peg exactly what the dates were for Mithraism. But for Sol Invictus, we know the 23rd actually was the birthday of the invincible sun. And that got, because there was an emperor in the 3rd century AD who tried to make this the official state religion, but he got assassinated really quickly, so it didn't really pan out. But and so these ideas of these emperors trying to pick a religion to build the empire on was a precedent already set. So when Constantine came along and he looked at his grab bag of religions that he could pick, he picked Christianity. That was actually, he was following precedent, and picking a religion that spanned both empires because he needed both halves of the empire because he needed to unite the empire. And he found the Christians useful because his opponent in that civil war was anti-Christian. So for him, it was politically convenient to side with the Christians because then he could use that politically. Once he unified the empire, that was his goal. He could use that to really, meddle in and use the church to control things. So that we know is the case. But yeah. So
and his mother was a Christian, so there might have been like that familial tie to it, and that.
Well, he had Lactantius tutor his sons. So Lactantius was the Ken Ham of the time. I mean, Lactantius was the biggest nutcase Christian that there was. He's the guy who's still claiming the earth is flat. Even though even his Christian peers are telling him, shut the fuck up. You're so wrong. Educated Christians knew that the scientific evidence establishing the sphericity of the earth was just ironclad. It's really solid. Some of the best science of the ancient world. And no, his argument was round earth means that there's upside down people on the other side of it. And that's just ridiculous. I refuse to believe it. Yeah, so like I said, Ken Ham of the ancient world, and so Constantine picked that guy to tutor his sons, which they're the future emperors. So
lucky for us, yeah.
It doesn't work out well.
Does science take a decline as religiosity starts to bring up? I
mean, yes.
Now, there's other things going on too. You mentioned to me, in a podcast long ago, there was a mortal wound to the Roman Empire. So we have to take that into account.
Religiosity and science can go along hand in hand happily. We have many examples. So the problem isn't religiosity per se. It's a particular hostility to a way of doing religion. What was going on, what was really popular among the elite prior to the 3rd century AD was religion was very empirical. You didn't have scriptures. The evidence of the senses was obviously, how God made the world. If you want to know the answer to that, you go observe the world and experiment with the world and figure out how the world works. Then you know how God made the world. You don't go look in a book and say, God wrote this book and he says. So it's much more empirical. It's much more based on, it's valuable to study the work of nature and to learn more about it. It's valuable to be curious and to question and to argue. These are all valuable things. To make progress in knowledge was very valuable. So these were things that were fundamental in the elite mindset at the time. Now, that was when the empire was flourishing, and it was the Pax Romana, the Great Roman Peace. There was some war, but it was pretty stable. A lot of prosperity generally. All ships were rising, all boats were rising, kind of thing. And but in the 3rd century, you had basically a 50-year-long civil war. Of where you had 20 emperors, something like in a period of 50 years, just all killing each other. Right. There's no political stability, massive deaths in terms of military action, and constantly fighting with each other. You've ruined the economy, and at the end of which you had the Great Depression, the collapse of the fiduciary economy. So you basically, if you imagine in the U.S., our civil war, which lasted 5 years, imagine it lasted 50 years and ended with the Great Depression. You can imagine the U.S. would be fucked, right? Like that would be it would be like Weimar Germany would be closed.
What year did it collapse?
That's what happened.
What's the calendar date?
It's in the early 270s.
Okay.
So I think something like 271 or 274. I can't remember. We can peg it to almost the exact year as to when the prices the value of the currency just plummeted to nothing. And that's when they had draconian price controls, and the reaction to it was to go more fascist, exactly like what happened in Weimar Germany. You had that collapse, and what do you have on the heels of that? Nazis and Hitler. And so you had the same thing in Rome. You had Diocletian, and you had these other Romans that are clamping down and being much more draconian, death penalty for every possible offense. And then when the Christians took over by, fortuitously, a Christian emperor won a civil war, and then didn't get assassinated, luckily. So he was able to establish and consolidate power for 30 years, 20 or 30 years. And then you had that when the Christians took over, they just took over fascism because they said, this is great. We love this fascism stuff. Let's stick with this. And so then you had basically Christian fascism. So it's not that the Christians invented all of these things. The pagans were fucking things up too. Like the pagans were getting more mystical. They're getting more anti-empirical in the course of this, 3rd century where everything's going to hell. So people are losing confidence in their worldview, and they're racing to, supernatural worldviews. They're racing to mysticism. They're racing to afterlife beliefs rather than, solving world's problems through rationality and things like that. All of that's already happening, across the world and across the Roman Empire, both among pagans and Christians. So it's just that when the Christians took over, they just really solidified it and didn't change it. And that's one of I think the biggest indictments you can have against Christianity is they didn't fix it. They just loved this fucked up version of things, and then just made it worse.
But it could be an indictment of the culture that they were raised in, because in one sense you could see just an obvious power grab, right?
Yes,
that's totally unethical.
But blame on the pagans. Like the pagans never established a peaceful succession of power. They never established a stable constitution. There's a lot of things that the pagans screwed up and are to blame for on this. But then the Christians can't claim that they fixed it either.
Correct.
Christians ran with it as well. The Christians created the freaking concept of peasant. It's one of the first true Orwellian events in human history, where Constantine issued a decree where he said all free men who are renting farmers or renting land, or farmers renting land, are now bound to the land, cannot change their jobs, permanently owe fiefdom and duties to their landlords, and could be sold with the land, right?
Wow.
So and he says this is as befitting free men, right? So it's like basically calling them. He's saying he's supporting their freedom by essentially turning them into slaves. So there's a massive expansion of slavery. They created the serf, the concept of the serf, throughout the Middle Ages.
That's where feudalism begins.
Right. Yeah, and that begins that whole system that lasts 1,000+ years after that.
And these are
which is the exact opposite of the American Revolution, right? Which is what the Roman Empire needed, really.
But you think like the reason to do this is they were hoping to kind of save the culture, save the empire?
You bet. Yeah. Just like Hitler thought he was saving Germany, right? It's the same thinking. Stalin thought he was saving Russia.
Yeah.
It's always that way.
Yeah, that's wildly interesting.
It is. And then you see even like the Holy Roman Empire. That still seems it's trying to be a continuation of, what went before, but kind of under, a different guise, where you've got the Pope crowning the emperors. Yes. That's completely different than the way it started. So that's it's a long and interesting story for sure.
Yeah, it's so funny when the Christians say that the Christian Church invented separation of church and state. Because look, the Pope and the King or the Emperor were different people, therefore it's separation of church and state. It's like you don't know how society worked back then.
Yeah.
Because if that were the case, we wouldn't have needed the American Revolution. Because there was a reason why separation of church and state meant get the fucking church out of government. Period.
Right.
They don't get to make laws. They don't get to tell people what religion they're going to follow and all of this. No, that was a radical concept. It was kind of pagan, honestly. It was kind of a return to the way the pagans did things politically and religiously.
Yeah, what were the pagan priests like? Why weren't they kind of preemptive to power grab? Because you'd seem like anyone that would want to, that in this day you want to get power. Are priests holding a lot of power at that day, or is it landowners?
You're talking about the American Revolution?
No, like Roman priests that are pagan. Mm. I don't mean priests, but I mean
Yeah, the pagan priesthood was greatly weakened under the empire. It didn't really have the kind of authority or political influence. In fact, the state became more and more secular. The priests and augurs and people of that station became less and less influential. People gave less and less of a shit as to what they thought, which, on one side is a good thing. But it's a bad thing when you have then someone take over and then institutes a whole new religion that takes over things. You don't have any strong institutions, you don't have a counter-religious institution to battle that.
Or blend it.
But right. So they just didn't have any political power or influence. And like I said, that was actually a positive direction for things to go in. But when society collapsed, everybody ran back to religion, and then it was musical chairs until a religion got picked, and then it was Christianity when the music stopped.
Okay. So this is a good segue to your new book. It's out, and I think we should take a look. I don't know if it's yet on Amazon.com, but it's The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire.
Yes, it is available in print. It might be available in Kindle already, but if not, it will be soon. And I'm recording the audio now, so it'll be on Audible like all my other books are early next year. All my other books are on Audible already. But yes, it's The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. And it's the sequel to my book last year, which was Science Education in the Early Roman Empire. And what that one was is basically all of this. These two books are my dissertation at Columbia University. And I took that and dressed it up for a lay audience and expanded it a bit. And I took one chapter out, the education chapter, and made a separate book. So that's a little book just on the education system, which is fascinating in itself. If you love education theory, if you want to know how education worked in the ancient world, it goes over the whole education system, and then has the focus of science content, including pop culture. How did science infiltrate among the illiterate masses? How did they have access to science knowledge? They didn't have TV, but they had public speeches. They had things like this. Even jury duty was a form of a channel through which science information would promulgate to the public. And so it covers all of that stuff. So if people want to do the education side, it's in there. But then they had the rest of the story, and that's The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. So this is a huge book. It's huge because of my dissertation. They're basically looking at a university dissertation. But what it was originally, my dissertation was on attitudes towards the natural philosopher in the early Roman Empire. And so the book is about who these people were, the scientists, basically, who they were, why we can call them scientists, and what did people then think about them? What did they think they did versus what did they actually do? And then what did people think about them? Did they like them? Did they hate them? What stories did they tell about them? And then other things like, did the ancient Roman world understand the concept of scientific progress, and did they value it? Did they see it, and did they see it as valuable? And things like that. Did they see scientists as heroes or villains? Those kinds of things. And then I compare and contrast pagan with Christian attitudes in the first 3 centuries. And the comparison does not come out well for Christians. The Christians are night and day compared to the pagans in terms of how they reacted to science and scientists and their whole mission and their fundamental values. So if you want to see that contrast, it's with quoting primary sources extensively, and I've surveyed all the evidence that's available on this. So it is definitely the definitive book on that subject.
Yeah, that's something I want to read, because when I think of Roman scientists, the one that comes to mind is Archimedes, and I think that he's 200 BC. So I don't even know if I can name a Roman scientist. You can name some of the orators and the politicians, but
he's
in that time,
not even Roman. I mean, he's a Roman. He was
the Syracuse, right? That's Sicily.
Attaché to the Sicilian court, who were allies of Rome until they rebelled, and then the Romans besieged Syracuse. But the thing is, he was so respected, Archimedes, and Archimedes was, I think, unquestionably one of the greatest scientists of the ancient world. But there were many phenomenally great scientists of the ancient world. He was just one of them. He was so respected that and I talk about this in my book too, the stories people told about him tell you things about the culture, right? But when you look at it in the actual context of how the Romans saw him, he was so respected that the Roman general that besieged Syracuse gave orders to his soldiers, absolutely do not kill this guy, even though Archimedes was renowned and infamous for designing the siege weaponry that defended Syracuse that really jacked up the Romans. Like, he was responsible for a huge quantity of deaths because all the weaponry he developed and the siege works he developed were so phenomenal. And but the Roman general said, "Do not kill this guy. We want this guy."
And then they accidentally did anyways.
Yeah. It reminds me of in the movie The Right Stuff, where someone says, "But our rocket scientists are Nazis," or no, something about the Russians. The Russians have these Nazis, and it says, "Yes, but our Nazis are better than their Nazis." Because we captured Germany in World War II, and we actually started using fucking Nazi rocket scientists.
Yeah, Werner von Braun.
Jobs, to develop our space program. So we sent people on to the moon on the backs of Nazi scientists. But anyway, that was the thinking, and he wanted him to survive. But there was a Roman soldier, quote unquote, accidentally killed him. One could read into that. Maybe it wasn't so much of an accident. A little bit of private revenge, but. That was his death. But yes, like you said, that's 212
so
BC.
Outside of him, who's one of the favorites that when you came across that you it's an unknown story that you love?
Yeah. Oh, well, okay, stories is another thing. But if you want to get to great Roman scientists, the one you really should know, the big names, and that's Galen, Ptolemy, and Hero. Hero of Alexandria was one of the greatest engineers, 1st century AD. Ptolemy, greatest astronomer, engineer, geographer, physicist, 2nd century AD, and Galen straddles the late 2nd, early 3rd century. And he was biosciences, so he was medical. He was a doctor and did physiology and things like that. And those are the three greats. There were others there were tons of other scientists who all of their works are gone, so we don't even know what the quality of their work. And there's some people we have just fragments from. We know Menelaus was a late 1st century astronomer who was greatly revered. He was considered the greatest scientist of his age. Not a single one of his works survive except fragments of in Arabic translation of a little manual he wrote for emperors on how to do weights and measures and stuff. But but he did a lot of other stuff. He did. We also have his spherical trigonometry. He invented spherical trigonometry. But he did a bunch of other stuff, and it's all lost. We have other authors we know about. I think Archigenes is this doctor in the 1st century who did a whole scientific study on figuring out the correct doses of hellebore for surgical patients. And he would dose dogs. He would use dogs as his patients, and he would dose them to see how much of a dose is fatal, how much of a dose is not enough, what is the right dose to knock someone out so you can perform surgery on them without killing them. And he figured out a dosage per weight. So the amount of drug per kilogram, or what they didn't use kilograms back then, but the equivalent weight measure they had. And so these kinds of scientific things. So we only have descriptions that he did this. We don't have the book that he wrote that everyone was relying on. Another famous example is Ptolemaeus. Ptolemaeus is late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD. And she's the only – there's 2 female Roman scientists we know by name.
Is Hypatia the other one?
No, she's much later, right?
Yeah.
But yes, the answer is yes, but she's much later. We also know Pandrosian is 4th century professor of mathematics, but we have nothing from her. We just know she was revered. After her, early 5th century was Hypatia, who, of course, gets dragged and killed by a Christian mob for being too ostentatiously forward for a woman, too intellectual and outspoken for a woman.
But Ptolemaeus is a woman then. What'd she do?
Ptolemaeus. So Ptolemaeus was widely revered in her period as one of the greatest scientists in acoustics and harmonics. So the study of sound and music in particular, but they applied music theory to sound analysis as well. So she wrote a famous treatise. We don't have it, but we have quotations of it from admiring scientists and philosophers who liked her work, where she talked about how you had to fuse theoretical reasoning with empirical study to create a superior science of harmonics, and you can't divide these two things. You can't have theory separate from empiricism or vice versa. So we know, and there's probably a lot more she did, but that's the one thing that we have her quoted talking about. But so there are a lot of these other scientists, and we could go on. I list all the ones that we know that we have at least a quote from or some description of what they did. There's an encyclopedia that lists everyone we know by a name, even if it's just a mention of a name. We have nothing else. So there are even further collections, but I cite those encyclopedia references and stuff.
Okay.
And that's all in. I have a whole chapter, a whole section in Scientists in the Early Roman Empire where I do a canned history of ancient science from Aristotle on. And I even have an appendix on pre-Aristotle as well. But so you get all the names and all the development. You can see how science was progressing in the three great fields of antiquity, which were astronomy, physics, and medicine, biology. So there are tons, but a lot of this, so much of this stuff was destroyed. We just have
so we don't have any
tiny amounts.
We don't have any sense of their personalities. No good stories of how they got down on Saturnalia or anything.
We do actually, but not as many as we would like. And we love authors when they're chatty. So Galen is a super chatty author, and the Christians loved him, which was great because it meant they preserved tons of his work. Not all of his work, but they preserved a lot of it. And Galen's a really chatty author, so he loves to digress and tell stories, and so you get a lot of stories from him, and that's very useful. Of course, he's talking about himself and people he met and stuff like that, so you have that skewed lens. But whereas Ptolemy, for instance, is not a chatty author, he hardly ever chats about the people he knew or the things he did, so we don't get a lot of context information from him, which is unfortunate because we'd really love to have a Galen for astronomy. We'd love to have someone chatting about, who's the astronomer everyone hates, and what's going on in astronomy and all of that. But we don't get that from Ptolemy. But we also get Plutarch, who wasn't a scientist, but he's a really prolific writer.
Am I correct to say he's an historian?
Kind of. He's an essayist. I would call him an essayist. He doesn't write histories. He writes biographies. Okay. The biographies are a little fanciful. It's not some of the best history of the ancient world. He's an author, so he's more like today someone who would write a popular market biography as opposed to a really scholarly biography. He's the popular market biography writer. But he wrote this huge collection of essays. We don't have the complete set, but we have a lot of it. And he just ranges across tons of subjects. And because he's so chatty, we get a lot of stuff from him. And he knew a lot of people. So he knew Menelaus, the astronomer, and he wrote a whole fictional dialogue involving Menelaus and some other astronomers and stuff. So we have things like that. But one of the stories, one of the stories he tells is a relative of his back in the time of Cleopatra. And Cleopatra is right at the verge of where the Romans are taking over Egypt. And Cleopatra she kind of revived an intellectual movement in Egypt. She revived the sciences in Egypt before the Romans took over. And so she's kind of responsible for the continuation of science. The reason science was really centered in Alexandria, even under the Roman Empire, was set in motion by Cleopatra. It had been set in motion long before that, but there was a period in between where the scientists were expelled from the city because they were too hostile to the political situation. But when Cleopatra took back power, she really funded this, really brought scientists back into her court. She loved talking with these guys and dining with them and stuff. And Plutarch tells a story about this relative of his who was best buds with the head chef of Cleopatra's kitchens and was also regularly invited to dine with Antony and Cleopatra, which is the highest level of society in Egypt at the time. And so he was one day he was invited to dine with them, and so he went and visited the chef because he wanted to check out all the shit in the kitchens that would be interesting to a scientist. He says, I heard you're going to cook an elephant heart. Can I dissect this elephant heart? And he's like, yeah, sure. And so, it shows this feature of the scientists being inquisitive, being wanting to like observe things and be really excited about the opportunity to dissect an elephant heart, and also the fact that they straddled both social classes. They were totally comfortable with being in the lowest part of society, like hanging out in the kitchens and talking and cutting up a heart, and then in the evening dining with literally the highest royal society that there was, and they were welcome in both places, and that's because scientists came from. They were kind of like this upper middle class that had lower class roots. Scientists were definitely not the aristocracy. There were aristocrats who loved science and wrote about it, but they weren't usually scientists themselves. The scientists were these guys and some women who were raised by men or women who earned their living, essentially. So like Galen's father was an engineer who was poor, but was such a successful engineer he became rich and acquired some lands that produced money, and Galen lived off the foundation, essentially the money that he earned off his lands, and that was all because of his father, the engineer, who is through engineering became, he went from lower class to upper class, essentially. He was straddling that thing, and when you look at all the biographies of ancient scientists, they fit into this middle place, and they get along with both societies equally well, and are just as facile with their hands and getting dirty, and with like books and thinking and rationalism and stuff like that. So that's the reality. And you often hear from early 20th century historians the opposite, that the ancient scientists were not like that. And it's not the case. And so in my book, I extensively document this, and I'm not the first to have done it. In the last 20 years, there's been a huge boom in ancient science studies. Historians have overthrown tons of common fixed assumptions that had been normal since the earliest 20th century. So there's been a lot of really great peer-reviewed history of ancient science in the last 20 to 30 years. It's just amazing. And so my book catalogs all of that and talks about it and builds on it.
That's good. So if you're like me and you're trying to figure out where the United States is compared to Rome, I was trying to figure out, are we in like 110 AD and still coming up, or we approaching that 250 area, So this would help me like parse that out, right?
Yeah, the analogy is weak. Everything's different. I mean,
right.
Like our access to physical power, meaning thermal power, our ability to exploit energy is vastly, vastly greater. The fact that we have things like the internet. I mean, these are things that just they throw off the curve. Like we can't base the future on the past anymore, because our present is so radically unlike anything that's ever pre-existed us. We really can't predict the future beyond cyberpunk novels, maybe. But but Kristyn, you did you have other things you wanted to talk about regarding Saturnalia, or did we already cover the things that you wanted to talk?
Oh, I found in Europe, especially, I was kind of prowling around the internet, and it's making a bit of a comeback and being added to. People are having actually Saturnalia parades now.
Really? In Europe?
Yeah. There's
this sounds amazing.
It's really interesting. There's a town called Chester. I think it's in the UK, and they have they call a Winter Watch festival, and they've actually added a Saturnalia parade that kind of wraps up the whole thing. So they have the effigy of the god they carry through, and so that's really, if anybody ever has time, it's a really good, something to look up on the internet. You just put in Chester Saturnalia, and you can see this whole Saturnalia parade. But you can actually find, more of the thing.
I think it'd be great for tourists if you're going to go visit Europe. Mm-hmm. Like pick a time where something like that is happening to go see it, right? That would be something to experience. I've seen videos of pagan ceremonies or pseudo-pagan, neo-pagan ceremonies. They're so much more fun and interesting than Christian stuff.
Yes.
Boring Christian stuff.
Yeah, it's really good. They have actors that people are really into the history of Saturnalia, and they reenact the whole thing. It's really interesting. Really? I mean, there's no sacrifices, and
that had ended even in the Roman Empire, but it had, by legend, that was a feature of the Saturnalia. I don't know if that was ever really the case, but all the ancient writers said that like the original story was that someone would be picked to be the king of the Saturnalia, and then he would be killed at the end of the festival. So human sacrifice was affiliated with it. We don't actually have any records of it really happening in connection with the Saturnalia, but that was the lore even in antiquity. And then hence you get the movie The Wicker Man. But anyway.
No. I hope they treat him really well, for those 7 days that you're partying.
Correct. No, he's literally the king of ceremonies. So everybody has to do what he says. He's feted and taken care of and all of this stuff. And then in the end, he's sacrificed.
Is that the Lord of Misrule? That's kind of
the Lord of Misrule is the early, medieval British, UK. All these words are anachronisms. But anyway,
yes, that's right.
That island.
It isn't that far back yet.
The Lord of Misrule is among them. And yes, historians do connect that with the original Saturnalia tradition. But by then, it had undergone a lot of iterations and evolution.
Right. And as over time, it got a little bit longer, and certain emperors would sort of use it for political, reasons, from what I've read.
Nero.
Mm-hmm.
Nero, Caligula. Yeah. Caligula loved it in particular because if you look at the history of Caligula, everybody, reads Caligula as insane. He's like, what are you doing, like having your horse run for consul? Like, you must be mad. But when you really look at you analyze it in context, it really looks like Caligula was so contemptuous of the elite. That's why he was so popular with the people. He was really contemptuous of the hypocrisy of the aristocracy. So a lot of what he did was just humiliating the aristocracy until they killed him. It was basically what happened.
So he's a version of Donald Trump.
No, he was not, because what would be a good analogy? I don't even know a good analogy today. If Donald Trump were deliberately fucking with people just to make fun of them and to make them look ridiculous, Donald Trump is not that smart.
Right. Yeah, that's the problem.
Nor does he have that sophisticated motivation. So Donald Trump is dumber than Caligula.
So add Derrida into Donald Trump.
Yeah. But what you're saying, Kristyn, is Caligula and other emperors fiddled with a number of days. So there was a period where it was a 7-day festival, from the 17th to the 25th, I think. Is that right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then it was 17th to the 23rd. Like, it varied. But I think the 25th date came from that. Like, that was part of, it was the final day of the Saturnalia, and that's where the December 25th thing eventually got crept into Christmas. It became the thing. But the gift giving day would be the 17th, or was it the 23rd? Now I don't remember. But it was one of the...
there was Opalia around the 19th, and she was like a consort of Saturn, I think, at some point. So I knew there was one day.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of days.
Yes.
A long week of partying.
Yes, it really was. From the 17th to 25th, in the longest period of it, when it was a 7-day festival, you couldn't declare war. You would never have trials, so no one would be. There would be no legal trials going on, and a lot of rules would be relaxed. So, like the laws and rules against gambling were relaxed, so you could dice and gamble and stuff, and they relaxed social niceties so that slaves could talk back to their masters. That was considered okay. Now, the reality is, because it ends on the 25th, there was a limit to how much talking back you could do, and for it to not be remembered on the 26th.
Yeah, right.
But that was the idea. And the idea was that the masters would serve the slaves. Now, the slaves still cooked the food, but there would be this ceremony where the masters would serve the slaves, and the slaves would sit at the high table, essentially. So there's this idea of upturning society, reversing society was part of it. Gift giving was a big thing. So, and in fact, gift giving, it was very important. Like, part of the etiquette of the giving was to not give a fabulous gift. In fact, the poorest or cheapest gift you could give that was still something that charmed and delighted the person you were giving the gift to, that was your goal. And it meant that you really understood them and you had a true friendship with them, because you knew what trivial little thing you could give them that it would delight them. And so a lot of the goal was to come up with these sort of trivial gifts. And then, that evolved in some cases into prank gifts. So apparently Augustus was a fan of that. We have lists of gifts that were given to people, and they're really interesting, cute little gifts, like, combs and things like that. But candles and statues and little statues and things like that nature. But so there was gift giving. There would be gift cards. So you'd write a little poem on a card that would come with the gift. There was caroling. Apparently, sometimes it would become naked caroling. So caroling was a thing. Wreaths on doors was a thing. Candles in the window was a thing. So there are a lot of these features. Oh, and Christmas bonuses. So masters and employers would give bonuses to their slaves or employees so that they would have money to buy gifts for for the people in their networks. So the Christmas bonus was invented by the Romans. So like there's a lot of these features that we associate with Christianity or with Christmas come from Saturnalia. And then when you merge in the Germanic and Scandinavian Yule celebrations, that's where you get the tree. Decorating trees goes way back in paganism. But the idea of the fir tree, chopping it down, bringing it in, and decorating it, that's very much Northern European, Germanic, pagan ceremony. But when you add that and various other things like mistletoe and stuff like that, you add that to the Saturnalia, you have nothing left, really. There's nothing that comes from Christianity.
Right.
There's nothing Christian about Christianity. They just hang a little Jesus on the tree and then they call it Christianity. And they call it Christmas.
Right. So to make Christmas unique, you really have to hide your sources.
Yeah. Right.
To make Christianity unique, you really have to hide your
Well said. Yeah, that's true.
That's a good point. That's a great.
I've always felt like Christmas was sort of like it's sort of Christianity in a way. It's like it's a symbol, It's a holiday that always reminds me of how many other things are really underneath that other religions.
That's a good way of looking at it. I also, there are certain people like Tom Flynn and certain other major figures in atheism and free thought really don't like Christmas. They think we should get rid of it, and I think no, we should take it over as we've already done, because it's a pagan holiday and nobody really believes any of the pagan shit involved in it. So it's not really a Christian holiday. We love the things about. We love the Christmas spirit concept. We love the spirit of the season. That's really a Saturnalia thing. We love the aesthetics of it. We love the message of it. None of that comes from Christianity, really. And I think maybe the nativity scene is probably the only thing that they throw in there that's distinctively Christian. And even that seems largely divorced from what does that have to do with the tree, the decorated, what does that have to do with mistletoe? What does that have to do with Santa Claus and elves and reindeer? It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
The only thing is they have the Magi giving gifts.
And who were the Magi? What religion were they? So
Zoroastrian.
Right. So how far do we take this?
Astrologers, apparently.
I know.
Yes.
Well, Richard, if you can get us back to our culture to the week-long party, I imagine your patron count would skyrocket. You pull that off.
Yeah, well,
the naked partying would probably help too. Yeah.
Well, I've done that, but that's on a large scale thing. Well, I did naked Thanksgiving recently. That really is a thing that happened in my life.
Wow.
Anyway, I didn't plan it. I just went to it, and it was like it worked out really well. But
well, you're halfway to Saturnalia. You just got to add singing.
That was very Saturnalian, yes. Because another thing is sexual license was another thing that was associated with Saturnalia, and the Christians didn't like that. They had to try and get rid of all the sex going on surrounding Saturnalia. But yes. Before I went on talking about orgies, what was I talking about?
Caroling is going to take on a whole new meaning after this.
Well, I think it's like we live in snow country, most of us now. Where
maybe in Florida, naked caroling in Wisconsin would be
naked caroling
frostbite.
in Florida would work. Yes, the Mediterranean is much more tolerable to do that.
Yeah, you don't have a whole lot of that in the Nordic countries, so you don't have naked Yule.
No. Fur-covered Yule.
I just wanted people to sort of learn a little bit more about it because I do see that coming back. A little bit. Actually, WikiHow has a page on how to throw your own Saturnalia party.
Oh, that's awesome.
WikiHow, I love that.
Yeah, it was kind of cool, but it was just it was interesting to me to see that kind of making a resurgence after all this time, that you can even get online and see that people are adding this to their winter festivities. So I wanted to make people more aware of it, maybe research it, look into Saturnalia and add some of those traditions or, back into what you're doing with your winter celebrations. There's so many of them, but it still is a time, like you mentioned, people would give candles. It always seems like there's a lot of reference to candles and light.
Yes.
So either way, whatever you're celebrating, it's about thinking about the light coming back during the dreariest time of the year.
Yeah.
And that you're talking about the holidays being pagan. And I think it's not something that atheists have to necessarily kind of shirk off because of it having religious associations. I think it's something that you can, by embracing what was pagan about it, it kind of does kind of weaken that the current religion, their hold on it.
Oh, and, absolutely.
It's interesting to me because it takes you back and it connects us back further in time to other people in history than we sort of realize that we are. But people have been doing this for so long, and there's so many traditions that sort of echo, through time, still putting light out in the middle of the darkest time of the year.
Yeah.
And hoping, looking forward to the time when the cold starts to end, and we're on the upswing now. So it's very probably the strongest example of how we should treat religion. The way people in reality, the way people really treat Christmas is you've got Santa, the reindeer, the stories. Everybody watches Elf or they watch Christmas Story or whatever. We all know it's fiction, right? Like we're not. No one's saying you have to believe any of this, and they just love the metaphor of it. They love the ideas, the values, and stuff. The Christmas spirit as a thing.
Yeah.
Dickens, A Christmas Carol is really like definitive. It's become really structurally central to Christmas, and it's total fiction. No one thinks it's true. No one thinks that was a real story that happened. I don't think there are really ghosts
or Ebenezer Scrooge.
But they love the values, they love the story of it, and they love the aesthetics of it. And these are things that we can appreciate secularly. That I think do really fly in the face of the Christian attempt to reclaim Christmas, which they will never succeed in doing because they've lost this war long ago. Right. They don't control Christmas. Christmas has nothing to do with Christianity anymore, unless you're a Christian and you specifically go out of your way to insert Christianity into it. Nativity, going to mass, things of that nature. But other than that, it's really not. And if you have juxtaposition, a Christmas Carol, like the Scrooge story, and the Nativity story, maybe people sort of say like, wait, these are the same thing. These are both bullshit stories. Mm-hmm. That might have messages, and then they can actually evaluate, do I care about this message or not?
Yeah.
I don't have to believe it or not believe it. It's not relevant whether it's true. It's all about, is the story neat? Do I like the story? Do I like the message that it conveys? And then you can decide. And I think we're at this point in culture in general, in human history really, where people can experiment with their culture and try new things. And we've seen that evolve in Christianity. You had mentioned like people bringing in Saturnalia and trying to like toy with their traditions and try to create new things. And there are people who do that. And I think there's a lot more allowance for people to look for the culture that resonates with them. I have an example of that, which is to bring in the Christmas Carol concept again. There's a thing in San Francisco that I love called the Dickens Fair. And it's like a Ren Fair, except it's Charles Dickens' world. Cool. It's all indoors, so it's a permanent night. And it's a permanent Christmas. And so it starts, I don't know, like the beginning of December and runs to like Christmas Day or something. And you can go there and you can just go adventure in this town that's been built with people doing carols, and they have, bars serving ale, and they have the Adventurers Club, and they've got the Dark Garden has they have their the window girls where they have they sell they make corsets, so they have women in windows doing the display of their things. And it's all this sort of Victorian era feel to it that is just so joyful and interesting to do. And a lot of people love that aesthetic. And I say, like, that's a really neat cultural thing to do. But you notice not everybody does it. We don't say you have to do this. If you don't do this, you're a weirdo and we're going to shun you or whatever. You can pick the culture that resonates with you. And you see that with, not all black people, but some black people go for the Kwanzaa tradition. You have there's the Hanukkah tradition can be interesting to explore. There's a lot of different things that you can pick and choose. There's these Yule traditions in Iceland and Scandinavia that are very interesting that you could import. And I think a lot of people are doing that, but like looking around to say, what are the traditions that I want? What are the things that matter to me? And I think in Christmas in general has become, the gift giving is a very big feature of it, and the Christmas spirit of it. But the thing that I see is the Thanksgiving, what has happened to Thanksgiving, which is not connected to Christmas. But we've divorced it largely from, like, it's almost completely divorced now from the mythology of us being nice to the Indians, which is never the case.
Right.
it has become kind of like a family. This is a day for everybody to get together, and you have your Thanksgiving friends, people you might only ever meet on Thanksgiving, and you have this Thanksgiving party, and you create a great meal, and everybody shares the meal together, and you have this one sort of celebratory event that people get together and hang out for a whole day. And that's kind of evolved, kind of what most people do for Thanksgiving. And I like that. I think that's a neat thing that we've created, and that has secular value. It's not attached to any sort of religious assumptions, and we can abandon the bullshit that originated the trying to create this mythology of kumbaya between the whites and the natives. We can get rid of that and just treat it as for what we like it, what values we want to convey through Thanksgiving. And I think we can do the same thing with Christmas, and it's easy to do because there's hardly anything at Christmas that's really Christian about it.
Yeah, that's what I call it, the ancient wisdom of it, the essence, the spirit, if you will.
Yeah. So what were they trying to do?
It's always made sense in terms of like agriculture. It's, that's the time of the year, especially in the North countries where there was a lot more slaughtering of herds, and the harvest was done, and then naturally you're kind of stocking up for the winter. So I think it's just something ingrained in us anyway. So we're probably always going to do something, this time of year.
Yeah, that's so true. Like the funny thing is we've become so divorced as a modern Western society, and frankly, pretty much almost everywhere now. Like Asia is catching up with us on that too. Is that we're not such a rural dependent society anymore. Like most people are so divorced from the rural reality. And I talk about this in my science education book, Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, where we take for granted certain things. Like in antiquity, your average illiterate person would know way more astronomy than your average college educated person today. Because astronomy was so fundamental to the whole agricultural and calendrical cycle of the time that you needed to know some stuff like that. You needed to know, you knew more biology, you knew more botany, because you knew more about plants, you knew more about animals, because that was your livelihood. You lived off of that. You had to know when do certain things come into season, when are certain things available. You had to plan for like, well, gosh, this particular product is not going to be available for another 6 months. We have to plan for that. We don't have that anymore. We can have tomatoes every month of the year. It's like people are so cut off from what used to be the case in terms of like the rurality and the farming nature of our society. that people have lost that. So we've forgotten a lot of the things you're talking about, like how agricultural we are. And I think I'm thinking also how weird it is. We're so dependent on this because of the tilt of the earth, this sort of random feature of where we are. And if you imagine aliens on another planet somewhere in another galaxy, they might not have that. They might not even have seasons, right? They might have year-round crops. They would come to us and go, you guys are weird. Why do you have this like strange, like the sun's going to die ceremony? This is very weird. Like, and you only harvest in 1 month or 2 months out of the year. That's really bizarre. What's the matter with you? Of course they would understand scientifically why that was.
Well, no, it was really strange. We would just tell them that, Persephone had to marry Hades and Demeter got pissed.
Hopefully we'll have a better answer to that. And then they'll come back and say, no, actually, it's just physics. Sorry.
Right. Or that.
What's really going on here?
This is good. Thanks so much for going through like the mythos with us and the science. I'm fascinated by all of this. So we really appreciate it, Richard. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, you bet.
And Kristyn, thanks. You know so much about this. It was a pleasure podcasting with you.
Oh, thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Mythinformed. Mythinformed is brought to you by Mythicist Milwaukee. Producer Sean Frasick, Associate Producer Fritz Blondon and Kristyn Whitaker Hood, Engineer Josh Benishek, and host Brian and Dimitri. Each week we produce a new podcast that sheds light on religion, secularism, and mythology. If you enjoyed the show, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/mythicist. Mythicist Milwaukee also brings major secular conferences and debates to the Milwaukee area along with community events, both local and online. To support us in bringing future events, visit mythicistmilwaukee.com and hit the donate button located at the bottom of each page to place a financial donation amount of your choice. And now, our closing theme, written and performed by Shelley Siegel.
There was a time when everyone believed Poseidon in the sea, Athena's wisdom and beauty, and Hades underneath, Isis of fertility, and ether of the Greeks. They all lie at rest, and who will be the next to die? You know they are all myths, and who will be the next to die? There was a time when everyone believed Helios in the sun, Poseidon in the sea, Athena's wisdom and beauty, and Hades underneath, Isis of fertility, and ether of the Greeks. They all lie at rest, and who will be the next to die? You know they are all myths, and who will be the next?